Hey there, my name's Luke Jennings and I'm the VP of Research and Development at Push Security. And today I'm going to be here talking to you about understanding the new SaaS cyber kill chain. So, how did I get to this research topic? Like, why even look at this? Why look at the SaaS cyber kill chain? So, as a quick overview of my background that led me to this point, I'm very much from a sort of red team and offensive security research background. That was how I started my career. Then I moved more into the detection response space, but in sort of dealing with endpoint compromises and lateral movement on internal networks. So I was involved in like designing some EDR software, doing threat hunting research, helping run an MDR service, that kind of thing. So then I moved to Push, and we're focused on securing cloud identities. Now, obviously, SaaS is a huge part of that. So I really kind of had to go back to basics and say, well, okay, let's say we can't compromise endpoints anymore, or there's no internal networks compromised, like everything that my background is originally involved in. What do you do? How do you attack an organization like that? How do you compromise an organization without touching the endpoint? So that's really where this came from. It was kind of going back to basics and saying, okay, this is like, will be a new era of attacks. What does it look like? What is the kill chain like? What are the attacks like? So that's where I came into this area for research. So through the rest of this talk, we're going to have a brief history of how we got here as an industry, quickly look at sort of SaaS adoption and how that's moving. Then we'll look at like what do traditional attacks look like? How am I sort of comparing to these? How does that compare with new SaaS-related attacks, and what does the new cyber kill chain look like in this space? And then we'll dive into like the individual attacks. So we'll look at a few kind of phases of the kill chain. We'll look at some sort of pretty traditional attacks you'll probably be familiar with, but we'll look at how they differ or have slightly new flavors in the SaaS world. And then we'll also look at some pretty fundamentally new attacks and how they work in the SaaS space as well. So very brief history. If we look back to say the 2000s, like that's when I first got started in the industry. If I look at that now, I'd say that's the era of traditional perimeter hacking. And we were dealing with things like port scanners and vuln scanners and that kind of thing. And then web apps came along and Wi-Fi came along that introduced new attack surface. That was the sort of the era really. And the response from the industry was, okay, firewalls, DMZs, network and segmentation, then like the introduction of good patch management and secure coding and new wireless standards and those kind of activities. And that obviously like provided defense against many of these attacks and sort of shifted attacks a little. So by the time we get into the 2010s, I think if I look at that era now, that was very much when endpoint became the new perimeter. We saw a lot more of a shifting to endpoint focused attacks bypassing DMZs. So we started looking a lot more at phishing with sort of malicious file attachments, office macros, that kind of thing, all aimed at gaining an implant running on an endpoint as a foothold into a network, and then having command and control frameworks that enabled an attacker to control that endpoint on a network and then try to move laterally around. And the response of the industry was very much, well, okay, like lots of endpoint hardening, the creation of the entire EDR market, which is a huge market with lots of players and really interesting software, the sort of increase in the use of SIMs and like the introduction of larger scale red teaming exercises and threat hunting techniques. And that was kind of the response to that era. So the position I think we're in now is I'm thinking in 5-10 years time, if I look back at the 2020s, what am I going to say was the defining sort of bit of this era? What were the techniques of the day? What was the response of the industry? And I think at least at this point, I'm already looking at this and thinking, well, this era is going to be the era of where cloud identities became the new perimeter. And the question mark really is, what are the techniques of the day and what's the response of the industry? And that's slightly more to come. So what drives shifts in attacks? Well, there's two areas. We kind of partly alluded to this earlier, but you've got, on one side, you've got improved security controls. So, as an industry, sometimes we introduce security controls that work well, and that drives shifts in attacks. Others may not work so well and may not have an impact. But for things like, let's say, firewalls, VPNs, patch management, they had clear impacts in the industry and drove, shifts in attacks in some ways. And then in more recent years, things like EDR, XDR, that kind of thing has had a major impact in the endpoint compromise space. So that's one era, and that's driven by the security industry. The other thing that causes shifts is just general technological shifts. And this is completely outside of security. So if we look back slightly longer ago, like the creation of complex web applications and Wi-Fi, for example, created an entire new attack surface that didn't really exist before. And that drove shifts in attacks there because there were vulnerabilities in that new attack surface. And if you look at in more recent years, I'd say the same thing is now applying to things like remote working and SaaS-native organizations. So if there's no internal network to attack anymore, then that's a massive technological shift. And at the same time, you've got the introduction of lots of SaaS apps. That's a new attack surface. That inherently has to cause a shift in attacks. And I think that's the place we're in the SaaS space right now. So SaaS adoption. I mean, I guess first of all, what do I mean by SaaS here? I'm pretty much saying any business app, you don't host yourself really. But in general, this SaaS use is rising rapidly. Now, it was something that was occurring anyway, but I think when the pandemic happened, that obviously forced a lot of people into remote working that weren't otherwise planning it. And that caused a rapid uptake in SaaS services at the same time. So really what we saw a trend that was already occurring just get accelerated, and now it's very commonplace. So even for larger, older enterprises, many of those make use of lots of SaaS services already, migrating increasingly that way, even if they still have large internal networks as well. So that kind of like what I'd refer to as hybrid SaaS companies. But in the startup space, many newer companies now are either SaaS first or even completely SaaS native. I mean, we as a company, Push Security, are a good example here. We are just a fleet of MacBooks and lots of different SaaS apps that we use. We don't have internal infrastructure in the same way that legacy organizations tend to. And this is only going to become more normal as more enterprises shift this way, and the startups of today that may tomorrow be the large enterprises. This is going to become more normal. So what does this look like from an infrastructure perspective? If I was to look previously, I'd say that at a very basic level, this was often the most basic kind of infrastructure we'd see. We'd have an internal network that hosted like a fleet of laptops and desktops and maybe some internal servers. So like office connected systems would be on there. Then we'd have like a DMZ that would host some servers and databases and so forth that would support external services, whether that be for customers or maybe like a webmail server for sort of remote employees. And then perhaps remote workers or workers that were traveling would connect in via a VPN to access the internal network. And then what happened was, if an endpoint attack occurred in this space, we'd have something that looked a little bit like this. So an attacker would say send a phishing email, compromise a laptop on the internal network. They would have an implant running on that would then connect out to an internet-hosted command and control server, and they would control it that way. Now, if we look at what things look like now, in SaaS space, we're looking at, say, an architecture much more like this. So we've got hardened laptops, not on an otherwise internal network, just connected to the internet, and they are then just connecting directly to SaaS services via internet connections. And in fact, those SaaS services may also have connections between themselves via OAuth for sharing data as well. We'll come to that a little bit later. But we have something that looks a lot more like this. Now, for hybrid SaaS companies like larger organizations, generally now a lot of them have both parts of this diagram. They've got the old on the left and they've got the new on the right. And for newer companies, pretty much we're just looking at the right side. So we've got very well hardened endpoints that are hard to compromise and just connecting out directly to SaaS services. And that obviously changes the threat landscape. So what do the kill chain phases look like now? So this is where I started the research. I thought, okay, well, before I dive down into the attacks, like, does the old cyber kill chain make sense still? So obviously there's a few different iterations of this. I just picked the sort of phases from the well-known MITRE ATT&CK framework. And I thought, okay, like, is this reflective of the new world or not? And I think broadly speaking, most of it is, and it's just that the attacks within these phases have changed. But I would say there are some slight differences at this high level. So for example, the command and control phase, I would argue that does not exist in the same way anymore. That whole phase is kind of focused around bypassing network infrastructure, getting around traffic filtering controls, working your way out of highly segmented networks, for example. That's not something that exists in a SaaS space in the same way. Most SaaS apps are kind of intended to just be internet accessible. So if you've got the right credentials to access them, you just access them directly. You don't really need to bypass traffic filtering controls or network segmentation. Broadly speaking, that's the case here. So I think this phase is kind of gonna die slightly in this new world. The other one that's slightly different is execution. So traditionally speaking, we'd be talking about code execution with that. So we'd be thinking about gaining native code execution or maybe like scripting languages like offensive PowerShell, that type of thing. So getting code that attacker controls running on an endpoint or on a server they've compromised. Now in the SaaS space, most SaaS apps are based around not allowing customers to run code at all, as in they just provide business functionality that customers use. It doesn't normally involve producing custom code to run. So this is a slightly different phase in that it doesn't apply quite so well to the SaaS world, but there are some things that I think fit into this. It's a little bit of a grey one. We'll come to that in more detail later. Everything else, though, I think broadly speaking, applies pretty well at this high level, and it's the attacks themselves that have changed. So we'll look at that now. Okay, so if I was to go through every phase and every attack that could be in it, we'd probably be here for hours. I'm not going to do that. What I'm going to do is focus on a few key phases to give an idea of how they've changed and look at a few representative example attacks that fit within them to give a sort of feeling for how this is changing. So if we start the recon phase briefly, in the traditional world, I'd say the recon phase was things like port scanning, a service enumeration, user enumeration, and then getting email addresses to target for phishing, that kind of thing. In the SaaS-native world, I think we're much more concerned now around SaaS discovery and general cloud identity enumeration, including SSO enumeration. So the attack surface for a SaaS-native organization now is the SaaS apps they use and the cloud identities that allow access to them. And that could be via SSO cloud identities that have been mapped into certain SaaS apps, and it could also be local cloud identities on individual SaaS apps as well. So really, we want to identify what SaaS apps are in use, what the tenants are, and what cloud identities can be used to access them. That's really the recon phase in the SaaS-native world. So there's one sort of fairly simple example. SAML enumeration is a good one. SAML is used to connect SSO to SaaS apps, so it's a good thing to do. But if you do that as an organization, it's quite common for SaaS apps to enable someone to see this as a result of just making a logging attempt with a valid email address or even just a valid email domain. So in this case, we're using RAMP as an example. I'm showing the difference between a domain test.com, which obviously hasn't been mapped for real use, and then another one, webflow.com, which is just a publicly acknowledged customer on their website. And you can see how the difference in responses are and how one of them then returns the provider ID for Okta. So through doing something like this, we can see whether a domain has been connected for SAML, and therefore is that organization a user of this SaaS app? And then we also get to find out what their SSO portal is as well, which can both be very useful for attacks, launching further attacks. This is something that's common across lots of SaaS apps. This is a basic enumeration technique where SSO is in play. Another example is like slug tenant enumeration. So many SaaS apps, and we've got Bamboo as an example here, require you to give a name for a tenant when you create a new tenant, when you sign up. Now, this is a little bit like registering a web domain. You get to pick it as long as it's still available, and then it's often referred to as a slug. In this case, we're showing a similar example for an invalid customer, and also one that's publicly acknowledged on their website as being a customer. In this case, SoundCloud. And we can see that we don't know 100% that it's really SoundCloud that signed up for this Bamboo tenant, but someone has created a tenant on Bamboo called SoundCloud. In this case, it then also links into a custom login for their particular tenant, which includes a reference to Google for social logins. So If that is a legitimate SoundCloud instance, we'd also then think, well, perhaps they're using Google Workspace as well and linking SSO via social logins to Google in some cases. So that gives us some information there from a recon perspective. And again, this is quite a common sort of technique that will work against lots of different SaaS apps that work in this way. So it's another example of recon. So if an attacker was to take these types of techniques and apply them to lots of different SaaS apps and target a particular organization, then they may gradually build a picture of what SaaS apps are in use, and which ones are connected to SSO, for example, what the SSO portal is, and that's what kind of recon looks like in this world. Okay, moving on to initial access. We'll spend a lot more time here because it's one of the most interesting phases, because here we're talking about how do you gain that first foothold on a network. And okay, the phrasing I've used there, on a network, is the traditional example. So with initial access, we're normally talking about how do you gain that first endpoint compromise, which gives you a beachhead or a foothold into the network in order to start moving laterally from there and escalating privileges. So really, in the traditional world, this was phishing and Office macros and file format bugs and everything, like all sort of geared around getting an endpoint compromise and then leveraging that later. In the SaaS-native world, we're obviously sort of kind of ruling out endpoint compromises and saying that there's no internal network to move around. So how would you attack a company like that? And I think there's a couple of different things here. There's some slightly different takes on traditional attacks, and then there are some fundamentally new ones we'll come to later. So for the sort of older style attacks that have a slightly different flavor in the SaaS world, I'm thinking about things like credential stuffing. I'm thinking of variations of phishing, like consent phishing, and different vectors for phishing, like IM instead of email, and just general cloud identity compromise. So we're not compromising endpoints, we're compromising cloud identities that give us some level of access into SaaS apps in use by a target organization. So if we start with credential stuffing, okay, credential stuffing has been around forever. You know, we're talking about credentials that it could be leaked from a sort of known password database dump. It could be they've been purchased or stolen. It could be those creds have been phished at another time, or even we could just be using generally guessed known weak passwords. But the difference in the SaaS space is that previously there was generally only one or two places to try these creds. So maybe like a VPN endpoint or a webmail endpoint or something. And ideally, that front door, so to speak, would be quite well protected. There'd be strong password policies, there'd be good account lockout policies, there'd be good logging, and there might be MFA. But in the SaaS space, we may have a situation where users have accounts on lots of different SaaS apps. Maybe, you know, an individual user might have 30, 40, 50 SaaS apps in use if they're a heavy SaaS user. And it's unlikely that they're all going to be connected to one SSO endpoint. I mean, not all SaaS apps even support SSO. Many of them charge a lot more money via enterprise tiers in order to enable it. And then there's also lots of shadow SaaS uses. So there's only really going to be SSO connections when it's been a sort of centrally managed IT decision to use that SaaS app, not when users are sort of self-adopted. So the simple fact is we'll probably have lots of cloud identities on lots of different SaaS systems, and they may not be as well protected as your core sort of SSO logins. So it could be that there's outdated passwords there, or weaker passwords, or a lack of account lockout, no MFA, that kind of thing. And so really this kind of amplifies this attack because an attacker has so many other doors to try for the same account and password combination. And so that's what initial access looks like with this sort of attack. Really, we're talking about trying lots of different creds across lots of different platforms and seeing what drops out. And so instead of an initial 1, 2, 3 endpoints being compromised on an internal network and that being the initial foothold, it might be, oh, we found one account on Make, one account on Dropbox, one account on Zapier, one account on Postman, and so forth. And that's the initial entry point into an organization. And then the attacker from that point will be trying to figure out how to leverage that access to move elsewhere. So that's how credential stuffing sort of differs slightly in this space. We've also got things like consent phishing. So consent phishing is something that already happens. It's happening in the wild, and it's a slightly more interesting take on phishing. And I think it's so heavily tied into the SaaS world that it's probably going to become more common because consent phishing abuses OAuth integrations to grant access to data to an attacker. So OAuth integrations allow different apps to share data between them. Most commonly, this will be via core applications like Google Workspace or Microsoft Azure, for example. but there are other SaaS apps that enable data to be exposed via OAuth 2. But the interesting thing with consent phishing is like MFA doesn't protect against it because it's not related to your actual login. You just grant permissions by clicking a button. It also uses legitimate URLs like Microsoft URLs, Google URLs. So if you train your users to look for suspicious domains, they're going to be legitimate domains. They're not going to be suspicious. And the other aspect is that it grants permanent access unless you explicitly go and revoke permissions that have been granted. It doesn't matter if a user changes their password or resets their MFA, the OAuth connections will stay valid. So consent phishing is a pretty interesting way of phishing to gain access. And I think we're only going to see it increase over time. And the other aspect is just a different vector for phishing. So whether it's kind of traditional malicious attachments or credential phishing, we've normally seen that most commonly via email, and that's because email is a standardized way of communicating between customers. But we're now seeing like a much more increasing use of instant messenger applications, not just for internal communications, but for external communications as well. So when instant messenger applications started becoming commonly used in the past, they were very much focused on internal communications. And in that sense, they're generally seen as more trusted by users as well. But obviously, given how useful they are, we're gradually seeing more shifting in terms of external communications moving to these platforms as well. So Slack introduced Slack Connect eventually to enable cross-tenant communication. Teams did a similar thing with Teams External Access. And so the point now is that external attackers, purely external attackers at the initial access phase, can send connection requests through to users. And it's not something that your average user is as familiar with as email-based phishing. And so, you can call a tenant whatever you like. You can call your username whatever you like. So in this case, I'm showing, like, let's say someone set up a tenant, called it Amazon, called themselves Jeff Bezos, and sends a Slack connection in. How is an ordinary user supposed to know that that's not the legit one? It's not as easy to see. There's also link preview spoofing issues as well. So like there's a lot of work in email clients that's been done to prevent certain common link spoofing type issues, or at least flag on them. Not that it stops everything, but at least some of the more kind of sneaky things are blocked. Like if you try and label a URL with text that's different from the actual URL, that often gets flagged. These same controls aren't always present in IM applications, and there certainly aren't centralized security gateways applying to everything in Slack and Teams commonly in the same way that we would often see with email gateways. So for example, in the bottom left there, I've shown an example of just linking to one of our blog posts and making use of a link preview. But if you click that link, it won't actually take you there. So that's basically a forged link preview, and attacks like that are possible in IM applications. So that's quite useful from a phishing perspective as an attacker too. And I don't think it's something that most users are as familiar with, so they'd be much more likely to be trusting once they've seen something like that. So that's definitely another area where I think we'll see a lot more attacks moving into. Okay, so I've covered the sort of traditional attacks you're familiar with, the sort of different types of phishing and credential stuffing and so forth. As I said before, they've got slightly new flavors, but we're also going to cover some brand newer techniques too. So we're moving into that space now. So one of these new attacks, I've been coining the term poison tenants. And the idea here is that rather than attack the SaaS apps that your organization uses legitimately, an attacker could set up a malicious tenant on a legitimate SaaS app and use that to attack you instead. So like, now that could be, say, they try to convince your users to join a tenant they control. And if they have admin control over that, that then means they can generally see all the information that transmits through it. So imagine, for example, an attacker sets up their own Slack tenant and managed to get your users joining it and using it. And as an admin, they had the ability to monitor all the communications there. That would obviously be a major concern. Now, it's probably unrealistic to expect this kind of attack to work with a major platform like Slack that will be company-wide and probably set up from the start. But it becomes more realistic if you look at smaller applications that might be targeted at certain teams. So if you come up with a new application that the marketing team might use, maybe you've heard that the marketing team of an organization are interested in it. With some social engineering pretext, maybe you could convince them to join a tenant and spoof that. So for example, in this case, I'm just using a wiki as an example here, Nuclino. I can set up my own tenant. I can call myself whatever I like. I can call the tenant whatever I like. And then I can invite users by email address. And then they will receive legitimate email invites from legitimate Euclino addresses inviting them to this tenant. If I combine that with some other social engineering pretext, it starts becoming more possible to get people to join. And then what happens is either that may be of value to an attacker because of what the user starts doing in that system. So potentially if they were uploading files or putting other information in there, once it starts becoming used and has a critical mass, it's just the people bookmark things and it's the tenant they use. It may be that there's interesting data there, but the other possibility is it could just be an innocuous platform that the targets are not concerned about. The data going into it is not sensitive, but it enables you to launch other attacks once you've got people joined up. And we're going to look at an example of chaining that with something. So we'll see that shortly. So just keep in mind the concept of poison tenants for now. We'll see more detail in a second. So the other new attack is something I've called SAML jacking. And the idea here is that SAML is a legitimate technology to enable SSO. So there are lots of SaaS apps that support it in order to connect SSO logins to their application for an organization. But what that requires is it means a SaaS app enables you as a user to, or as an admin user at least, to effectively set up a redirect to occur during the login phase. And that's how sort of the SAML process will work. But there's nothing stopping an attacker for signing up for their own tenant, like a malicious tenant, and setting up that redirect URL to a malicious one they control that's used for phishing, for example. And the interesting thing about this is that then gives an attacker a legitimate URL for an actual SaaS app with valid SSL certificates and everything, that during the login process, exactly when a user is expecting to enter credentials, will redirect to somewhere the attacker controls. Now, that means you can potentially trick someone, even if they're pretty security savvy and they're definitely checking out the initial URL they've received for a link somewhere is legitimate and it's definitely the right SaaS application, the right domain, the right SSL certificates, etc. It's a pretty useful social engineering capability. So if we're configuring an example here of redirecting someone to a malicious URL, this is an example using Euclino. What happens is then you end up with a legitimate Euclino URL that when someone goes to it, they're presented with a login box for that tenant, but then says, oh, okay, you can log in with SSO to this tenant. They click that button, and at that point, they're redirected to our malicious URL. And in this case, I've just used an example of showing a Google login page that would actually be like a fake login page that I'm using to phish credentials. So this is a pretty interesting social engineering technique. So first attack chain. Now we're going to look at the idea of how to combine a poison tenant with SAML jacking into a more effective attack. So there's now a demo video, so I'm just going to sort of move on to that, and we're going to have a look at these things in action, what they actually look like when they're conducted. For step one of the attack, we've set up a poison tenant in Euclino, and we're now going to use the built-in email invite functionality to invite our target users. We enter their email address, we click to invite, and then Euclino will send an email to that user from its own domains, inviting them to our poison tenant. If we then look at our team settings, we'll see that there is a pending invite for that user, waiting for them to respond to the invite they've had. For step two of the attack, we're going to look at the target user now who's received the email invite from Euclino. And we can see that it's from a legitimate Euclino domain, not from an attacker-controlled domain. So when the target user clicks the button to join, they're then prompted to enter their details in order to create an account as the first step. And once they've done that, so basically a one-step process, they then have an account with Euclino, and they are then automatically joined to the poison tenant. For the final step of the attack chain, we will look at the SAML jacking portion. Here we are looking at the configuration panel for SSO settings for the poison tenant. We've configured them to point to an ngrok domain that we control for testing purposes. Obviously, an attacker could register a more convincing domain if they so wish. We're now going to click to enforce SSO logins, which will result in Euclino prompting existing users by email to link their accounts to their SSO identity. Looking at the email the target receives, we can see it's a legitimate email from Euclino domains with a link that points to a Euclino domain. So there's no real cause for suspicion. The first path to compromise is if the target responds to this email directly. Clicking the button in the email, we can see we are immediately redirected to our malicious SSO server, and that shows us a fake Google login page in this case. If the user enters their credentials here, then the attack is complete. Alternatively, the target may not see the email or may not immediately respond to it and continue to use their authenticated session with Nucleino. Eventually, this session will expire, which we are going to simulate in this case just by logging out. This will cause existing tabs and links to redirect back to the tenant-specific login page. We can see this now has a large button prompting to log in via SSO. If the user clicks this button to log in now, then they are immediately directed to our malicious SSO page where they can enter their credentials for capture. Okay, so we can see how that's a very powerful attack chain when combined. So we've looked at a few examples for initial access, and we're going to move on now to the next phase. So now we're going to look at another very important phase in the kill chain, which is persistence. So persistence is a really interesting phase in the SaaS world particularly. And if I was to compare and contrast that with what came before, I think in the traditional space, I'm thinking about very endpoint-focused persistence. So things like run keys and scheduled tasks and services and other techniques for ensuring that your implant continues to run after a reboot or after a user's logged out and logged back in again, that type of thing. There are many different run keys, for example, on Windows that can be used for doing this. But from an IR perspective, at least the one benefit is that if you catch an attack early before someone's moved all over your network and you've got it limited to a few endpoints, you can isolate those endpoints, investigate them, take them off the network, restore them from a trusted build, and ideally, even if there's lots of different persistence mechanisms on them, you'll have successfully contained that breach. In the SaaS-native world, we're looking at a different type of persistence, and it's actually much more of a pain to deal with from an IR perspective. So, in the SaaS-native world, we're really looking at persistence at the SaaS layer, and we're looking at things like OAuth access. We're looking at basic things like API keys, link sharing, ghost logins where you can have multiple logins to access the same account. So there's a few different techniques here, but combined, there's so many different things that apply to different platforms. The problem you have is that one user might have many different SaaS apps they use, and an attacker that's compromised, say, a core SSO login for that user could persist in different ways on each platform. And so it becomes much harder to investigate and contain a breach that's occurred at that level. So we're going to look at a couple of examples of what these look like now. It's link sharing, very basic. I'm sure you'll all have come across this before with things like OneDrive or Google Drive. It's pretty common functionality in SaaS apps now to be able to share things with external users. And this is most common with files. So the idea with sharing links is that when it's someone internal, you can share with an individual user account. But if you want to share with someone externally, they probably don't have a login to your OneDrive or Google Drive or whatever a SaaS app is. So instead, you can create a sharing link, which should be unguessable for security reasons, but merely possessing the link is enough to gain access to it. So it has risks. Now, there's obviously risks of these being discovered elsewhere, but in the persistence phase, we're really talking about an attacker that's gained temporary control of an account. And this is actually a really great strategy for them maintaining access to data at this point, because let's say an attacker has compromised an account on OneDrive or on Google Drive, SharePoint, whatever the case. They could share like root folders or just share everything they have access to with sharing links, document all those in a spreadsheet. And then it doesn't matter if they get kicked out of the account or the password gets reset, or even if the whole user account gets deleted. For example, maybe in a disgruntled employee scenario, you could have a disgruntled employee who sets up all these links in advance, and then they are terminated from the organization, their account is deleted, but they've still got access via these links. So it's very basic functionality, but it's actually really powerful as a persistence mechanism. Now, with things like OneDrive and Google Drive, at least it's kind of in your face. So you can see when something's been shared. I think the problem is it's common to see this, that most people, especially in shared folders, are not really going to be questioning whether that was a legit sharing or not. So, it's a risk, but at least you can kind of see it and audit it more easily. But there are lots of other SaaS apps that have similar bits of functionality. So in the bottom right, I've got an example there from Nucleino. as a wiki solution, there you actually have to sort of go into the settings for every single page to go and see if it's been shared or not. It's not easy to see otherwise. So no one's finding that by accident. If someone goes and scripts up sharing every single wiki page after compromising a user, unless you've gone and built specific detection for that, that's probably never going to be seen. And then that's it. The attacker's got permanent access to your wiki. So they're very basic, requires no sophistication to use, but it's a very dangerous persistence mechanism. Another common feature we see in SaaS apps are API keys. Now, these aren't just for administrators. There are many SaaS apps that have APIs that can be used by ordinary user accounts. It's normally as simple as just going to part of the settings and creating an API token and then noting down that API key. And then they often last indefinitely. And then that's a way of effectively maintaining access to that account without needing to know the password, without requiring MFA tokens or anything like that. So this example here is from Shortcut, which is a ticket management system, but lots of SaaS apps have this functionality, and it's just another very easy way to maintain access to an account so that you can keep access beyond password changes and resets. So another one, this is kind of really a collection of similar techniques that I've termed ghost logins. But the idea here is that a lot of SaaS apps actually support accessing the same user account, but using multiple different cloud identities effectively. So rather than it being one authentication mechanism tied to the user account, there can actually be many. So for example, in the top left, I've got Shortcut as an example, and that's my Shortcut instance where I'm actually using a social login. So it's my real account. But there's still an underlying password for a local account in Shortcut. Now, in this case, I've never set a password, so it's saying that you don't have one. But if an attacker were to compromise my account and gain access to this temporarily, they could set a password there and then use that to log in. And I'd still be using my Google social login. And then if I change my password for that or change my MFA credits or whatever, they're not going to be able to use the Google login themselves, but they'll still be able to maintain access to Shortcut via this local password. So that's something we see commonly with certain SaaS apps. But similarly with others, like if this then that is the example in the top right, you can sometimes link multiple social logins to the same account. So in this case, I've got a Google one linked, but an attacker could go in and link their Facebook or link an Apple account and use that to log in instead. So again, then they've got their own user identity they could use to access that account that's separate from yours. So you can both simultaneously access it and they can maintain access that way. And Expensify is the bottom example, similar functionality again, but with what they call secondary logins. So you can just add a different email address and use that to log into the account separately to the main one that the victim user is using. So it's very similar functionality that's present in slightly different ways across multiple different SaaS apps. And it's a very effective way of maintaining persistence by essentially associating a malicious cloud identity with the user account you want to persist on. Okay, so they're the most basic examples out the way. We'll now move on to OAuth integrations. I spoke about OAuth mainly with regard to consent phishing earlier, and that's most of the time I would say that we see discussions in the security industry around OAuth. It's often related to consent phishing, but OAuth is actually really interesting from a persistence perspective as well, because in a persistence example, you don't need to trick a user into clicking an allow button like with consent phishing. You can just do it yourself during the time window that you've got access and then use that to maintain that access into the future. And it actually opens up a few other possibilities. So generally with consent phishing, we would see the use of custom OAuth apps, because generally an attacker needs to control all the variables with the OAuth app and able to make use of it. And we can do the same thing. We can do the same thing with persistence. We can create our own OAuth app and then just manually go and consent access to it, so that if we then get kicked out of the user account by IR or a password change or whatever, we've then used our OAuth app to come back instead. The really interesting thing, if you want to be sneakier at the persistence phase, is that we can also potentially make use of legitimate SaaS apps that are more likely to fly under the radar in ways that we wouldn't be able to do with consent phishing, because we don't have enough control over the app. So we don't control the redirect URLs, for example. But in a persistence example, we don't need to control the redirect URLs. So we can basically spoof legitimate SaaS apps and use that to be a bit sneakier. So for example, Here's Canva, which is a common SaaS app. Canva has the ability to connect to your OneDrive or Google Drive via OAuth in order to provide a place to sort of import and export files. So let's say as an attacker, I've temporarily compromised a core Azure account, for example, at a target org. I'm expecting I won't have the access long, so I sign up for my own Canva account with my own username and password, and I then connect the victim's OneDrive to Canva. And then that means I can make use of the custom functionality within Canva to browse the file system on OneDrive. If that user then changes their password, I'm going to maintain access via Canva. And if IR are looking into OAuth integrations and activity, they're not going to find some strange, previously unseen OAuth app that's suspicious to them. They're going to see a legitimate SaaS app in the form of Canva, which may fly under the radar. It's especially sneaky if the user already uses Canva, because then it would be expected to see it as well. The one downside to this is you're obviously reliant on what functionality is built in the app. So you can't make custom API calls like you could with your own OAuth app. But if you find enough apps that have enough functionality you're interested in as an attacker, it can still be useful. On the other hand, you can potentially kind of get the best of both worlds by impersonating client-side apps. Now, OAuth is also used by like sort of mobile apps and desktop apps, and they can't keep their OAuth secrets private because they exist on your phone. They're not on a server that only the company controls. So it's kind of explicitly possible to impersonate these, whether they make use of client secrets or whether they make use of public flows. Public flows are intended for this scenario. Some people still use confidential flows, but whatever the case, you can impersonate them yourself. So in this case, I'm just using Thunderbird as an example. Thunderbird had its client secret in its source code, which is expected because it's a client-side app and it's an open source app. What I can do is I can take that, I can impersonate that, and though I can't control the redirect URLs, I don't need to. I can just forward it to localhost, which is always enabled, and then I can manually consent to the permissions myself in a persistent scenario. And the other thing is I can request lots more permissions. So Thunderbird would normally ask for email access and calendar access, being a mail client, but I can request lots more permissions and accept that. And then again, if IR are investigating, they're going to see a well-known GUID that refers to the Thunderbird app connected to the user's account, which may fly under the radar and not be seen as suspicious as a custom OAuth app would be. So OAuth integrations are incredibly powerful for persistence. And certainly you can use them far more flexibly in the persistence phase than you would do for consent phishing in the initial access phase. Okay, so we're going to come back to OAuth a little bit. We're going to move on to a new phase here. So we've seen how persistence is pretty powerful. There's a lot of different techniques, and it's probably very hard for IR teams to keep on top of persistence in this new world. But we're going to move briefly onto execution. Then we're going to tie a few things together in another chain for an attack demo. So I mentioned previously that the execution phase was a slightly gray area because SaaS apps are kind of intended to provide you out-the-box functionality rather than you running your own custom code. So in the traditional space, the execution phase is normally native code execution, memory resident implants, offensive PowerShell, that type of thing. In the SaaS-native world, though, there are a class of applications that I consider the most code execution like. And that is effectively like automation platforms, no-code and low-code automation platforms. They enable often sort of GUI-driven, drag-and-drop, code-like functionality to be created by users in order to build custom functionality to integrate different SaaS apps with one another. So that is really what the execution phase looks like in this space, I think. So there's one attack here that I've termed shadow workflows. And the idea is that this is where an attacker will perform malicious actions by getting an automation platform to do it for them in line with custom functionality they've built within it. It's, I would say, the most code execution-like technique that I've seen in this space. And I really think it may end up becoming seen as like the offensive PowerShell of the SaaS world. It's really powerful, both for persistence and custom execution. So the sorts of SaaS apps that you can use for this are things like Power Automate, Retool, Zapier, Make, Tines, If This and That. There are more. These ones I'm partly familiar with myself, so I've used as examples, but there are more than this too. It's quite a big industry in itself. Essentially, you can set up generally things like triggers and actions, and you can customize that. So you could say, okay, every time this account gets a new email in their Outlook account, I want you to take that email and forward it to this other address. Or like every time they create a new file on their OneDrive, I want you to take that file and upload it somewhere else. And so you can see how that's pretty scary from a security perspective. The next thing we're going to talk about before we come back to that is a defense evasion technique. So just keep in mind the shadow workflows for now. I'm going to talk about this defense evasion technique, evil twin integrations, briefly, and then we're going to see them combined together, and it will all make more sense once we see that demo. So the idea here is from a defense evasion perspective. When we spoke about OAuth integrations before, I kind of alluded to this before with the sort of custom OAuth apps versus legitimate ones. There's a slightly different take on that that's also a way of making something more stealthy, and that's the use of evil twin integrations. And the idea there is that if from a persistence or execution perspective, you want to integrate an OAuth app, if you integrate one that's already in use, at least at the organization level, and ideally by the user that you're targeting as well, then that will fly way below the radar in comparison, because you avoid effectively a few different potential detection techniques. You avoid the detection of new OAuth integrations. So before we were talking about Canva, for example, if Canva is already in use by the organization, the security team aren't going to get an alert saying, oh, this new SaaS app's in use, because they've already approved and know that Canva's in use in that case, for example. But if you do it for a user that is also an active user of that same platform, so not only does the organization use the particular SaaS app, but the user you're targeting is an active user of that SaaS app too, then you avoid even seeing a new user consent. So if someone was really looking in more detail, maybe like using that Canva example, they'd say, oh, okay, like Canva's already in use, but we've just seen this new user sign up for it. Should that user be using Canva within the company? It's unlikely that people will pay that level of close attention, but at least they could see that. But with an evil twin integration, if you do it to the level that you integrate with an app that's already in use by the user you're targeting as well, at that point, you're like right below the radar. You're not going to be seeing new consent logs either. So the sort of logs we're showing there, this is what happens when someone consents to an app. We just won't see that in Azure if it's one that's already been integrated. So if there's a legit integration that already exists, an attacker can make a new malicious one and avoid generating those logs. Okay, so we're now going to see a combination of shadow workflows and an evil twin integration to show effectively a very stealthy way of maintaining access in the SaaS world and keeping under the radar and sort of building whatever functionality or malicious functionality you want because of the flexibility afforded by automation platforms as well. So we're going to see a video demo of that now.
To demonstrate our shadow workflow and evil twin integration attack, we begin the journey by being logged in as our compromised Azure account. We don't want to lose access to this account, so we are seeking to backdoor the account to maintain persistent access beyond password changes, MFA resets, or similar response activities. The first step is to enumerate existing OAuth integrations to identify potential targets for an evil twin integration. In this example, we will use the simple GUI option of browsing the apps list in the Microsoft My Apps dashboard. Here we can see there are multiple different Zapier integrations. Zapier is a powerful SaaS automation app and a great potential target. We'll look at what permissions have been granted. Looking at the Zapier To-Do app, we can see it's been granted permissions for file access, which is very useful to us. If we switch to the Zapier Outlook integration, we can see this has been granted access to email as well, another really useful capability. Okay, so it looks like the compromised user was making use of Zapier. Before we jump to creating our own shadow workflows, let's see if we can scope out their account to understand it better. If they've been following good security practices, they probably log in via SSO or social login, so we may just be able to log in directly with their Azure account. Let's give that a try. Okay, so it worked, and we are now in their Zapier account. Let's check out their automation workflows, known as Zaps in Zapier, to see what they were doing. It looks like they have one set up for forwarding expenses that connects their Outlook to their OneDrive. That explains the file and email permissions we saw earlier. Let's double check the integrations to check they look good. Okay, we can see active OneDrive and Outlook connections, and they're for the correct user account. All looks good. At this point, we could backdoor the existing expenses workflow, or we could create a new one and possibly hide it in a different folder. However, there is always the chance that the user may discover this later, and we may get locked out of the Zapier account too. Instead, we're going to create an evil twin integration using a separate Zapier account that only we control. To do that, we'll first sign up for a new Zapier account using our own Google account. Now that we have a new Zapier account, we'll create a new Zap to automatically forward new files in their OneDrive to our own Google Drive account. To do that, we'll create a OneDrive trigger on a new file and connect it to their Azure account. We won't need to consent to any Azure permissions as they have already been granted access by the user previously. Then for the action, we'll select Google Drive and set it to upload a file and connect it to our own Google account and consent for Zapier to access it. The end result will be that Zapier monitors the compromised user's OneDrive in the background and then copies any new files and uploads them to our own Google Drive. Let's publish that and then see it in action. We'll head back to OneDrive and create a new confidential file as a test. Now that's created, we'll head over to our own Google Drive and wait. And there we go, the file has appeared. Our shadow workflow is doing its job. And because we made it an evil twin integration, there will be no logs showing a new application consent or any new permission grants either. Even when the user changes their password, we can go back to our Zapier account and create new shadow workflows using the existing integrations to perform new tasks as well. All things considered, this is a very powerful attack chain.
Okay, so we can see how extremely powerful shadow workflows can be for both persistence and execution, especially when combined with an evil twin integration, because it just makes it that much more stealthy. So we spent a lot of time on persistence. As I said before, it's a really interesting part of the kill chain, particularly in this SaaS-based world. But we're going to move on to now another key phase briefly. So that's the lateral movement phase. So in the past, I would say in the endpoint world, lateral movement was very much moving from an endpoint to a server or endpoint to endpoint, server to server, essentially infrastructure component to infrastructure component. And the techniques we were then generally thinking of there were things like credential dumping, like remote service creation, software deployment tools, any way that would enable you to move between different infrastructure pieces. In the SaaS-native world, that's obviously changed. So really what lateral movement means in this world is moving from one SaaS app to another, or at least from one cloud identity on an app to a different cloud identity, either on the same app or a different app. And that's really what lateral movement looks like in this space, because obviously we're assuming a perspective of there being no infrastructure. So there are no infrastructure components to move between. And there's actually pretty basic techniques that can be quite effective for achieving this type of attack. So we're going to look briefly at these, like link backdooring, account recovery, integration abuse, like existing integration abuse. So we'll have a look at some of these ideas quickly. So link backdooring is pretty basic. We're kind of coming back to phishing type techniques, but the idea is that there are many SaaS applications that people use now that are seen as trusted internal systems effectively, but where it's very common for links to be in place. So this example is like a wiki. This is Euclino as an example. People use wikis, people use documents, people use ticketing systems. It's really common to put links in different places. Users are used to worrying about links when they come from what they are seen as untrusted sources like email. We kind of briefly mentioned earlier that IM was another sort of vector for this, but when you move to the lateral movement phase, you've got so many other options. And there just aren't the same security controls in place in trusted internal systems for link security. And users are not really thinking in the same way about being worried about links in these systems. So I'm just going to give a quick couple of examples. We can often put links in different ways. So for example, with Nuclino here, okay, this is just a legitimate link to Google, but we're using friendly display text to display it. But if you hover over, it shows you it goes to Google. You could, on the other hand, fake a link. So you could make it so the display text shows Google, but it actually goes to an evil site. But generally, these things are at least kind of in the user's face. If they don't, if they hover over and it pops up and then immediately click, they'll still see this. But really, in email, you arguably wouldn't get away with this with many email security gateways. Something like that might be flagged anyway, whereas it'll be permitted, and it's then reliant on the user to spot the issue. But you can do even more sneaky things. So, for example, in many systems like this, there's a limited preview size because it's not really being thought of as a security control. It's more of a sort of context control for users. So we could make use of longer domains to hide things. So, for example, we've shown this thing as, say, an internal SharePoint server and a legit domain for the next one. And then we make our link look like it is to that because it gets chopped off. But in reality, we've used our own evil domain and made use of subdomains to flesh out a link to get to a point where the beginning of the link is the same, but it's different at the end. And at the preview point, even a more security savvy user double checks quickly, it still looks like it's the same link, and they're going to have to then check it later in the browser if they want to catch it. So there's just really the option of kind of selectively backdooring links on platforms like this to try and laterally move to other accounts by conducting, say, phishing attacks against other users. And you could sort of shotgun it. You could create an API key and backdoor every link on the whole wiki and watch the sort of credentials flood in. Or you could be very targeted, like find a link to AWS in a sort of setup manual for new hires in the development team, maybe, and wait until the next new hire happens and hopefully compromise their AWS credentials to get access to sensitive admin functionality or whatever the case. There's a few different possibilities. Another very simple technique is just account recovery. We're all familiar with things like forgotten password, password reset functionality. In the SaaS world, email often becomes like a central point for how you gain access to accounts. So if you compromise someone's core SSO account that now has access to email, or you gain access to it through some other means like consent phishing or whatever the case, you can often use this as like being at the point of a hub to then go out to all the spokes, all the other SaaS apps. You can reset apps or use many apps support passwordless logins now too. So you can use that to move out to lots of other accounts. So you might have compromised the core Azure account, for example, and then you can use that to leverage it to gain access to other systems. And if you then set up individual persistence mechanisms on all those different apps that you've gained access to this method, you can see how this starts coming together and being very painful for incident responders to deal with. And the other option is just abusing existing integrations. So this is going to look familiar from something we talked about before, but I'm thinking about coming at it from a slightly new angle. We spoke before about, say, creating Canva and then setting up a connection for persistence, or creating a Zapier account and setting up integrations for persistence and for execute shadow workflows. But what happens if you gain access to one of these accounts? Maybe a user set up one of these accounts first, did an integration, then forgot about their account, and they set up with a weak password and it's not protected by their SSO credentials, and you've compromised this from a cred stuffing attack. Suddenly you land on a Canva instance that's connected to a OneDrive, or you land on a Zapier instance that's connected to a bunch of different other apps. And that gives you a way to move to these other systems. It's like a tunnel to those other things. You've compromised the Canva account, but you've actually got access to OneDrive as well. Or you've compromised the Zapier account, you've actually got access to Gmail and Google Drive and Outlook and OneDrive as well. So there are lots of existing integrations that can be in place between different SaaS apps. And so that often provides a sort of tunnel mechanism for moving between apps when you make one compromise. So that's another sort of common way that lateral movement can occur in this world. Okay, I said before, like there's so many different phases, there's so many different attacks. I would be here all day talking if we went over everything. I wanted to cover sort of some of the key phases and a few good examples of attacks to give a kind of good idea of what the cyber kill chain looks like in this space. I'm sort of coming on to the end of the talk now, so what I just want to do is quickly introduce a SaaS attack matrix. So this is on GitHub. This is effectively the long form of some of the things I've been talking to you about today. So it's an open source project where I'm trying to keep track of effectively it's like a MITRE style attack matrix, but purely SaaS focused and not in that endpoint space. We're just looking at different techniques that apply in the SaaS space, trying to document the different attacks, where they sit in the kill chain, and in every case, I've got at least 1 or 2 examples of SaaS apps that it applies to give ideas. And we're going to be, continually adding more to this at time as we uncover more attacks or interesting new examples. We'll be adding to this. So if you're interested in what you've seen today, definitely check out this project and keep an eye on it. We do add more content as time goes on, and there are a lot more attacks in here that we haven't covered in this presentation. So essentially, if you look at one of the individual instances in that SaaS attack matrix, we've just got that brief write-up. I'll show that on the left. I've also been releasing some blog posts going into detail around how you chain some of these attacks together. So the main project is focused on individual techniques themselves and examples. But in terms of like deep dive exploit scenarios with attack chains, I've been trying to come up with some good examples of that to blog about. So in fact, the 2 videos we saw earlier are effectively from 2 different blog posts around that. So you can see those on our website as well. And we're gradually releasing more posts in this space to give more ideas about attack chains too. So if you're interested in that, keep an eye on that as well. Okay, so coming to the end, what are the key takeaways from this? We've been through quite a lot in this webinar. So I think if you're really taking just a few things home, then really the first point is that the world is already hybrid SaaS. Like lots of enterprises have lots of SaaS apps in use. In many cases, a large amount of that is unofficial shadow SaaS, but it is in use. So the world is already hybrid SaaS. These attacks already apply, and it's increasingly becoming SaaS native. So as time goes on, this isn't going to become just new attacks that are possible. This is going to become the attacks that are possible, like the main attacks that are possible, because that's the way the technological shift is occurring. There also are many SaaS-oriented attack techniques that do not require endpoint compromises. That's another big take-home for this. But even if your focus at the moment is in the sort of traditional endpoint compromise world, I mean, obviously a large part of the security industry is still focusing a lot on this because endpoint compromises, they haven't completely gone away. Things have changed, but they're still there for sure. Even if that's your focus, persistence really opens up a whole new world in the SaaS space. So I would definitely look into persistence, even if you're focused on traditional compromises. As a final point, if you're a red or blue teamer, the SaaS attacks matrix hopefully can help you. If you want to get started in this space, check it out and see if it's useful for you in doing red teaming or blue teaming exercises. Okay, and so that's the conclusion of the webinar. Thank you very much for spending the time watching it. If you want more information, please check out our website, pushsecurity.com, or go to GitHub and check out the SaaS attacks matrix. Thank you very much.